For this section, we're going to take a bit of a historical perspective on how ancient peoples interpreted disease and how they decided to treat disease. And so for early humans, sometimes it's challenging for us to know what they knew and what they thought, because much of human existence was pre-writing. And so if there was nobody there to write down what was going on, it was really hard for us to interpret what they were doing. So what do we know about them? What did they eat? How did they behave? What about their diseases? And so because there is no real historical record left behind of their writings and things like that, what we have to look at are generally themselves, their bodies that they've left behind. And so scientists are able to measure health in prehistoric remains through analysis of what's been left behind. So one important feature that scientists can look for are what are called Harris lines. And you can see that here in this cartoon of a bone, these dense lines that go across the bone. And it basically indicates during, especially childhood, when the bones are growing, that there were periods where the bones stopped growing temporarily, right? So here the bones stopped growing, and then temporarily, and then it grew again, and then it stopped, and then it grew, then it stopped. What that can be indicative of during childhood is either a period of malnutrition or a period of significant illness that prevented the child from growing. In a healthy adult who had access to nutrition during their entire childhood and did not experience very severe, lengthy illness, you don't see those lines going across the bone. Scientists can also look at the teeth. They can indicate a number of different things from the teeth. One are called Wilson's bands, and they're changes to the tooth enamel caused by poor diet. Remember, our enamel is made of all the minerals and things that we eat, and so if you don't have a good diet, you don't get the right minerals you need, the right vitamins you need to help build your teeth can experience these Wilson's bands. And along those same lines, you have enamel hypoplasia, irregularities in the tooth enamel. And that can also indicate periods of malnutrition. So to understand at least a little bit about their diet, in terms of did they get enough? Did they get the right kinds of food? We can look at their bones and teeth to get clues as to the overall health of prehistoric peoples. What eventually scientists learned about prehistoric people is that early humans did basically subsistence living. They gathered enough food through either foraging or hunting to support perhaps only themselves and their family. And even then, as we see with those bones and teeth, there could be significant periods that lacked appropriate nutrition. Approximately 10,000 years ago, so before the present, scientists believe that prehistoric man began agriculture. The idea of actually growing your own food, so you didn't have to go out and look for it, so crops, setting up fishing, importantly for good sources of meat, domestication of animals. And because of that, because these early humans would plant crops that kind of locked them into place. You aren't going to abandon your field. So whereas man before this point was more of a nomadic existence, I guess you would say, settling down to have a farm, even if it was a very small farm, you stayed there. And if the area near you was good for planting, for raising cattle or other animals, other people might settle down next to you, and other people, and other people. And eventually, these small settlements became cities. And so with that, we ended up having the Neolithic or agricultural revolution. But something really interesting to think of in terms of the agricultural revolution is not that immediately these people had better health. In fact, most scientists believe that during the beginning of the agricultural revolution, so right towards the end of the Stone Age, that early man actually experienced a decrease in health because crops had not been domesticated in such a way that they had the nutrition they have now. And instead of having a more varied diet like a hunter-gatherer would, because hunter-gatherers had to go where the food was, so they got whatever food was in season. They got, kind of that natural varied diet. The early settlers were getting, the very, very basic nutrition from whatever crops they learned how to grow. So it took time for them to eventually develop good enough crops to support a more healthy society. Animal domestication was another novel thing to come out of the agricultural revolution. So not only were individuals domesticating crops in order to improve taste, size, nutrition, time to maturation, all of that, they were also doing the same thing with animals. Importantly, was easy access to meat for nutrition, so raising livestock like cattle, but also using animals as work animals, including horses, dogs, and then pets, of course, became very important too. So dogs, cats. And what we have to think about is how simply interacting with animals far more closely would have changed disease patterns. So once people started truly living with animals, not just hunting animals, people started to experience diseases that animals might have experienced as well, especially through things like fleas and other ectoparasites, fleas and ticks. But what really changed when people started living in groups was the complete disruption of life, really. Prior to the agricultural revolution, individuals did sometimes live in small groups, but again, they were nomadic. So it's very hard to take 10,000 people and just move them around all the time. So we're talking very small groups. But once people started to settle down and farm and raise livestock, you had these settlements which became cities. And so you had these groups of hundreds or thousands of people who were living in relatively close proximity to one another. They were interacting with each other every day. Sometimes maybe they were sharing food. If your neighbor grows one type of crop and you grow another, perhaps you can swap, or livestock, whatever. And what you have to think about, from that perspective is, what is the attraction of living in a city? Even now, why do we live in cities? Why do people, for the most part, live in a city? Well, there's easy access to all of the things that you might like to do. You can go to the grocery store and get food. You can go to the mall and get clothes. Your friends probably live close by. You can go to restaurants and get something to eat. Maybe you like to live in a smaller town. I live in a smaller town, but it's still a town, right? It's still a city. I still can go to the store, go to the restaurant, go to the park, talk to my neighbors. But why do I like a smaller town? Well, maybe because there are some problems that do come with city life. Things like garbage, right? There's a lot of trash when everybody's all in one place. There are social changes. You have to interact in a particular way when you live in a city. There are rules. You can't have a party at 3 a.m. You have to be a part of the society. There are changes in work. Well, we have all this trash. Somebody has to come pick it up. So there's a new job, cleaning up trash, right? The garbage collector, the waste management. Well, who's going to enforce the fact that it's 3 a.m. and there's a party and everybody wants it to be quiet? You have police who have to manage crime. So there are new jobs. You have all these kids running around. What are you going to do with all these kids? The parents can't stay home and teach the kids every day, so you have schools and teachers. And maybe we want to go to church. Well, you need a church. You need a pastor who lives in that community. You need a doctor. People don't get along, so you need lawyers to help settle disputes, right? All of these new types of work. So other problems with city life. The reason that sometimes people, I'm going to go out and live on a farm. Yeah, they usually don't live too far from the city, but sometimes they do. Crowds. Cities are crowded. There are lots of people. And this isn't as much of a problem now, but in early cities it was. There was a lot of fire. People now have central heat and air. Our houses don't usually catch on fire just because we're cooking or heating our homes. But when homes were using open flames to do that, it was more likely that a home would catch on fire. And when you're next to somebody's home that's on fire, your home might catch on fire. And there's a new job. We need people to put out fires. We need inspectors to make sure buildings are built appropriately. But of course, for the terms of this class, what's most important? Disease. When you live next to people, you're far more likely to spread disease among one another. And a lot of these diseases really didn't take hold until people started living in close proximity to one another. And it can be difficult for us to really truly understand what some of these ancient diseases were. One, because maybe there's no written record, or two, maybe your narrator isn't terribly reliable. They sure had physicians, but the physicians weren't anything like physicians we had now. They didn't have microscopes. They couldn't look at organisms and figure out what there was. Oh, you have bacteria. Oh, you have a virus. Like, that's not what they knew. So some relatively common ancient diseases we will talk about in the next few slides. But for the most part, we're guessing as best we can based on the descriptions of what was occurring at the time, based on descriptions of symptoms, because this is now after we have writing, so we have writing. And if we're lucky, perhaps being able to examine the remains of people who died during these, they called them plagues. So some of the ancient diseases that were experienced in cities are listed here. There was one called the Pharaoh's Plague, which was mostly characterized by bloody urine. And it's pretty well established that this was probably caused by a parasite called a schistosome. So the disease is schistosomiasis. They're little worms that live in the blood. In Athens, there was a plague that went around, and people aren't quite sure if it was typhoid fever or typhus. They're both bacterial infections, but they have very similar symptoms, so it can be tricky to tell them apart. In Rome, there were lots of plagues that went around, and they all got different names, depending on when it was, who was in charge, whatever. But based on, again, a lot of historical research, scientists are pretty sure that at some point in Rome, there was a plague of malaria, there was smallpox, maybe measles, maybe even ergot poisoning. So ergot is a type of fungus that infects cereal grains like barley and millet. So that's a problem when you do agriculture. You grow up all these crops, and the idea is you grow up enough crops during the growing season that you can store what you haven't eaten during the growing season and eat it during the off season. Well, storage, if it gets wet or damp, can promote the growth of fungus. And these fungal organisms can produce toxins, right? I think we've all probably heard of mushrooms, right? That produce, magic mushrooms. They produce kind of psychedelic compounds. It's not just mushrooms that can do it. Some other fungi can too. So they don't know what exactly caused the Cyprian plague, but ergot poisoning is also a possibility. And then bubonic plague, that one came around a lot, but bubonic plague, or the Black Death, is caused by another bacterium. So in the next few slides, we'll go over some of these infections, what the symptoms look like, and why scientists believe that these infections in particular were more common in our ancient cities.